Well, as we grow to know God, we become more and more familiar with his character. And as we worship him over a lifetime, we become more like him. And now there's an important caveat to that some of what God is like, we will never become. We don't become omnipotent or all-powerful. We don't become omniscient or all-knowing. Those are incommunicable attributes of God. Those are things that we never get. We never rule over the universe. We never reach a godlike state in that regard. But other attributes of God are communicable. They do become ours as in increasing measure as we live by faith. God is perfectly pure, and we grow in practical purity. God is perfectly true, and we grow in truthfulness. We don't ever reach his level of perfection in this life. We still fall short in many ways. But if we know God, we are on a long road to becoming more and more like him. We become like the God that we worship. And one of the attributes of God that we do slowly take on is that God is a just God. And if we believe that and devote our lives to worshiping him, then he increasingly transforms us into a just people. So Deuteronomy 32 verse 4 says, "The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he." Psalm 33, 4 through 5 say, "For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord." Deuteronomy 10, 17 and 18 say, "For the Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing." And then as people who are made in God's image, his requirement for us is that we do justice and righteousness. Proverbs 21 verse 3, "To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice." So doing righteousness and justice, which are two almost interchangeable concepts in Scripture, righteousness and justice, doing those things is more acceptable to God than any sacrifice that we could make or anything we could give for him. And so today we'll talk about what it means to do justice in the book of Proverbs and where we get the strength to carry that out. And now I know at the beginning of this, it might be really easy to tune this out, especially if we think that justice is just what happens in the courts. And so for most of us, either we're there, if we're not there vocationally or we're not getting in trouble very often, we might not spend a lot of time in the courts. And so this might seem like something that we could just tune out because that it doesn't apply to us. Also, I think we know that the term justice ends up getting co-opted by the culture around us and redefined pretty often. So we might think that justice is everything that we're told it is within the social justice movement, or just that it's something that activists do. But the truth is, some of that is justice, but some of that isn't, and some of that is anti-justice. But the fact that there are false versions of the real thing doesn't mean that there is no real thing. And doing justice or doing righteousness in the Bible and in Proverbs specifically actually applies to all of us. C.S. Lewis is helpful here. He says that justice means much more than just the sort of thing that goes on in the law courts. It's the old name for everything that we should now call fairness. It includes honesty, give and take, truthfulness, and keeping promises. So the idea of fairness actually sums up a lot of what Proverbs says about justice. It doesn't sum up everything, and we'll talk about some of the things it doesn't sum up. There is some of justice that actually falls outside of just that term fairness. But if we think of justice mainly as fairness, then we actually will see how it applies to all of us. And so, for example, parents often have to try to mete out justice and fairness with their children. I mean, friends have to be fair with each other. Managers have to be fair with employees. We have to be fair when we're helping people sort out a conflict or be fair when we're in that conflict ourselves. Anyone in any kind of leadership, whether it's church leadership or otherwise, they have to apply the principles of justice and fairness, and we all want to be part of a society that's just and fair. So doing justice is a daily requirement for most of us. It's not just for those in the courts, and it's not just for the activists. And so we'll start today with the Proverbs that talk about justice as fairness. Then we'll move on to talk about some of the Proverbs that seem to fall outside of that definition a little bit. And then we'll talk about where we get the strength to do justly. So first and foremost, we are called to fairness in our dealings. Proverbs 11:1 says, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." As you read through the Old Testament law, this kind of command comes up again and again. And this is because most of what they bought in the marketplace, they knew how much they were supposed to pay by weighing it. It was like the bulk section at Wegmans where they would go, they would get their stuff, put it on the scale, and on one side of the scale would be their grain. On the other side of the scale would be some stones that supposedly weighed a fixed amount. They would be marked with the amount that they weighed. And so to kind of put it into our units, they would have a stone that was 1 pound. They'd put that on one side of the scale, and they'd put a pound of grain on the other side, and when it balanced, they knew now you pay the set amount for that 1 pound of grain. But there were always dishonest merchants. There were people who take that 1 pound stone and shave off a little bit so that you were getting 3/4 of a pound, but you were paying for a pound. Or maybe they'd have 2 sets of stones, one that was very honest, so if anyone ever came and inspected, they could show them that they've got these honest stones, but then they had the other set of stones that they would use when they weighed out the grain for their enemies or people they didn't care about. They might have one set of stones for their friends and another for their enemies, different stones, different weights. It was a double standard. And Proverbs says that that kind of dealing is an abomination. It's a hateful thing to God. The prophet Micah echoes this in Micah 6:11. He says, "Shall I acquit the man with wicked scales and with a bag of deceitful weights?" God is really concerned about this practice. He hates a false balance, and he delights in a just weight. God loves true and accurate measures. God is true, and God can't lie, and he wants those who are made in his image to be true like he is true. And so a big principle here is that God's people who want to do justice with our lives should never rip people off. We shouldn't deceive other people to gain for ourselves. We shouldn't have 2 sets of standards. We should tell the truth. And if the stone says 1 pound, then that's what that stone should weigh. And we all know that this is how we want to be treated. I mean, we just take for granted that we are being treated this way. We take for granted that the scales at Wegmans are accurate. We take for granted that the meter on the gas pump is telling us honestly how much gas it's putting into our car. We're not measuring it to check. We take for granted that the odometer on the car that we're buying is accurate. And I think one of the reasons we can take it for granted is because there has been a historic influence of the moral law of God and of Christianity on our culture. There are cultures where it's considered a positive good to rip people off, especially if they're not really in your group. Like if you could show yourself to be the shrewd one who deceived someone with a dishonest set of weights, well played. Well done, you won the game. But if people deceive someone to rip someone off in places that have historically been widely influenced by the gospel, they might very well brag to some unjust friends who will cheer them on, but still, at least for now, society as a whole would frown upon it. I knew of a car dealer in the 80s who would brag about clocking the odometers back on cars so that he could sell them for more money than they were worth and rip people off. And he always found some shady friends who would cheer him on in that. But society as a whole still says that's bad because we've been historically influenced by God's moral law and by the influence of Christianity. We know that measurements should be true. And we're supposed to take that concept, that measurements should always be true, and apply that to all kinds of measurements. I once knew a pastor who had a bachelor's degree, but it seemed like almost overnight he started calling himself a doctor. And sure enough, he had a doctor's degree, but when he described what he did to earn that degree, it was basically the equivalent of what you would do in a 3-credit-hour master's course. But the institution was a degree mill. They gave those degrees, and so it was easy to become a doctor. And maybe he did that to get a raise from his church. Maybe he did it to gain some unearned clout and faux credibility. Maybe he did that because he was more concerned about image than truth, but it was an unjust weight or measure. Other people would go to school for years and years and work hard to earn a degree by the same name, but he applied that unjust measure to himself. And God really cares that we don't rip people off or gain from another's losing. He really delights in it when we're true. We don't want to have a just weight and an unjust weight to use if we just need it because we don't really like that person. We're called to not have any double standards. Now, you might feel like, okay, I'm off the hook here because I'm not clocking back odometers. I'm not recalibrating the scales at Wegmans. I'm not going for a false degree or try to earn a false reputation. But when Jesus talked about justice in how we measure, he actually applied this in a surprising way. And this is where I think we'll feel this. I think we're not off the hook here. He applied this in how we measure other people. Matthew 7, 1 and 2, he says, "Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it'll be measured to you." So Jesus took this concept. You should have one set of stones, one set of weights, and he applied it to how we assess other people and ourselves. And so while we might not rip people off in the marketplace, according to this standard of living justly, we use false weights and measures all the time. So for example, if you do something evil, I measure you, I assess you one way. But if I do the same evil, it's a lighter weight. I give myself a break. I have my reasons. I mean well. But that's just having two sets of weights. When we judge others by a standard that we're not keeping, when we want justice for you, but mercy for me, when there's no patience for you, but cut me some slack, when I want you to be punished, but I want to be forgiven, when I want to assume the worst about you, but I want you to give me the benefit of the doubt, I'm holding you to a standard I could ever meet. I've got two sets of stones. There's two sets of expectations. And sometimes we just do this of what we expect other people to do for us. I expect love and concern from you when I'm going through a hard time, but if you're going through a hard time, I don't give the same kind of effort that I expect from you. And I have my reasons. My life's really full, I'm really busy, there are really hard things going on, but I excuse it in me and expect it from you. So we all tend not to weigh ourselves fairly. When we assess ourselves morally, we don't do a really good job with the honest weights and measures. It's like when we step on the bathroom scale to weigh ourselves and we don't like what we see, so push down on the towel rack a little bit and sweet, there's room for the cheesecake, and then just run away from that thing. Like we're willing to cut ourselves some slack when we measure ourselves. And we do that for ourselves when we measure ourselves morally all the time. It's a little bit of weight on the bathroom scale so I can give myself a little bit of a pass. We have two sets of weights, one to weigh you and the other with a little bit shaved off to weigh me. But God delights in a just weight. Justice requires equal weights and measures in our business dealings, in our sales, in our purchases, and in our measurement of others. And remember, we do this because we're trying to reflect God. And God is just, and he will judge by one standard. Be holy, for I am holy, declares the Lord. So justice calls us to be fair in our dealings and in our measurements. Another big facet of justice in Proverbs is fairness in the midst of conflict and disagreement. It's inevitable that we will get involved in interpersonal disputes. We'll be involved in situations where we have to decide who's right or wrong in a dispute, situations where we learn that someone is accusing another of a bad behavior. One person comes to us with a bad report about the other. And we might even get involved in situations where we feel like we have a real enemy on the other side of that dispute. Well, there are a lot of Proverbs about how we're supposed to handle that and how we're supposed to be just in that situation. One of the things Proverbs calls us to is to not engage in any favoritism or partiality when we're helping sort out a dispute. Proverbs 18:5 says, "It's not good to be partial to the wicked or deprive the righteous of justice." Proverbs 24:23 says, "These also are sayings of the wise. Partiality in judging is not good." 28:21, "To show partiality is not good, but for a piece of bread a man will do wrong." Remember, Scripture says that God doesn't show partiality, and if we're living in his image, neither should we. I mean, often we get involved in the middle of a dispute and we choose the side of the people we like. We side with the people that we agree with on some other issues. We side with the people who are against the people that we're against. The enemy of my enemy is my friends. But Christians are supposed to be on the side of what's true. So when we're trying to settle a conflict or get to the bottom of issues, we don't apply partiality. This means that we don't favor people based on a group that they're part of. We don't favor people based on race. We don't favor people based on a socioeconomic status, based on who their friends are. We don't favor women over men or men over women. We favor the truth. But it's so easy to just decide who we're partial to and then take their side no matter what. I remember in my youth ministry days, there were times that I would have to call a parent to talk to them about the behavior of one of their kids. And most of them were pretty reasonable about it, but every once in a while, there was a parent who no matter what would take the side of their kid. No matter what. I must just be lying. I must just be out to get their kid. And so when I called to have this hard conversation, it was all on me and none on their kid, which actually probably explains why their kids behave that way. Where a just parent would say, okay, I'm hearing this report, and yeah, a youth pastor could lie. And yeah, my kid could lie. All right, so now let's hear the evidence. Now let's sort this thing out. It'd be easy to just take someone's side right away. Proverbs 18:13 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it's his folly and shame. And then another temptation in these disputes is to take the side of the one who can do the most for us. You know, here's a person who, she's in this dispute, and if I take her side, she'll accept me into her friend circle. She'll praise me to some really important people. But when we're calculating like that, we're not asking what the truth is, but we're deciding which side will benefit me more if I join it, what we're really doing is taking bribes, which Proverbs talks a lot about. Proverbs 17:23 says, the wicked accepts a bribe in secret to pervert the ways of justice. So when we're trying to help people sort out a dispute, we shouldn't first ask, what would be the most advantageous thing for me to do here? What would help me the most in this? We shouldn't ask, what stand that I take would play the best on social media? We ask, what's true? What's right? What's just? What's fair? What's proven? Lady Justice is depicted as wearing a blindfold and holding a scale because there shouldn't be different standards of justice for different people. Also, when we're trying to help sort out a dispute, it's important to remember that there are two sides to the story. And if we're trying to render some kind of verdict, if we're trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong and who should be treated differently as a result of this dispute, we are obligated to seek out both sides. Proverbs 18:17 says, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. I mean, parents of multiple children, we are familiar with this concept very quickly. She hit me. Okay, I'll sort that out. Did you hit her? She hit me first. That was important information. Why didn't I get that first? You try to balance, you hear both sides of it, and it changes your view of the situation. And we are unwise to hear one side of a story and act like we must be getting nothing but the truth. Because we're all pretty good at representing ourselves in a better light than we really should. But if we really have to sort things out, we're behaving unjustly if we just hear one side and we take their side and we act like we know the whole story. If we're going to render any verdict, again, not just in court, but just if we're going to treat somebody differently, we are obligated to seek out the other side of the matter and be blind in our meting out of justice. I mean, we're always telling people who come to us with issues in their marriage that we can't do marriage counseling with just one of you here. I mean, certainly, if we're talking to one person, we can sympathize, we can pray with you, we can help get you safe if you feel like you're not safe, we can give you advice based on the things that you're telling us, but also we always have to qualify it and say, you got to understand, I know I'm hearing your side of the story, but I need to hear the other side too to be able to really counsel and really help sort this thing out. And it's so easy when you just hear one side of the story to start giving advice, then to turn around and realize that all that advice I gave was bad, because I didn't have an accurate assessment of that story. So we hear both sides. Another super important facet of doing justice in the midst of conflicts and disagreements is that God's people should be committed to always only telling the truth, without exaggeration, and even about the people who have become our enemies in those situations. This is repeated a lot in Proverbs. Proverbs 14:25, a truthful witness saves lives, but one who breathes out lies is deceitful. 24:28, be not a witness against your neighbor without cause, and do not deceive with your lips. 12:17, whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. She says, only tell the truth. Only bring honest evidence. This means don't exaggerate, say only what's true, don't destroy a reputation falsely, don't try to deceive, speak the truth. Don't say too much, don't say too little, don't act like everything that you've heard about the situation must be true, don't assume, and don't let emotion take over so that you can give yourself a pass to say whatever you want about that other person just so you can win. But here's what makes this difficult. When you get in a really bitter dispute with a real enemy, and you start to see more and more this person is just wicked, you're going to be constrained by these rules and by the fear of the Lord, but they're not. Like, you will only tell the truth and you won't exaggerate any detail, but they're not following that same rule. You won't ruin their reputation falsely just so that you can win this argument, but they're willing to ruin yours. You won't lie, they will. You won't stretch the truth, they will. And so you can be in a situation like that and you can feel like there's absolutely no way I could win. I mean, what would happen in the NFL if one team was allowed to cheat and then the other team, they would throw a flag at just the slightest little infraction? Well, that team that's allowed to cheat would win. Look at the Patriots. Like, look what happened for 2 decades. I'm kidding, that was a joke. Not trying to ruin their reputation falsely. It was only a joke. But, sort of. But if you're in a dispute, and you play fair, you're just, but your opponent doesn't have to be just. You live with fear of the Lord, but they don't. Then what? Well, they might win. And this is one of those hard things about doing justice. We have to remember, though, as we're in a situation like that so is God. God really is there. He really is just, and he really does hate injustice. And listen to this promise in Proverbs 19:5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will not escape. So you might feel like your enemy is going to win because they can lie and you can't, but we do have to trust the justice of the Lord. Nobody gets away with anything. God does judge. And maybe that won't get sorted out in this lifetime, though often it seems like it does. Maybe that doesn't happen until they stand before him. And they may walk away with a smirk and a win in their mind. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we can trust that he's a good judge. So when you feel like you'll lose if you're living in the fear of the Lord, trust that God judges and that he does sort things out. Also remind yourself of the gospel. Jesus won by losing. I mean, wicked people did the greatest injustice possible against Jesus. They killed the only truly innocent person. They stirred up false witnesses against him to lie. Judas accepted a bribe to pervert justice. And it would be easy to look at Jesus while he's hanging on the cross and think that wicked people won. And if Jesus had just cast off the constraints of his mission, well, he would have won. He certainly had it in his power to win. But instead he died. And you look at him being put in a grave and you think, this is what happens. The good guys lose. But Jesus rose again. The wicked didn't win. Jesus did win, and he won by losing. And so God does sort things out. Jesus won by losing, so if doing right constrains you so much that you lose, and now I'm not saying don't use every just tool at your disposal. There are times where we do have to fight. There are times where we have to contend. And we do have to tell all the truth. We do have to make the arguments. We do have to anticipate some of the shady tactics of our enemies. Use all of the truth about the truth. You can use that in the situation. But if the only way for you to get a different outcome is to be wicked and deceitful yourself, don't do it. Accept the loss. Trust that God judges. Remember that Jesus won by losing. And also something else to remember is that Satan is not loyal to the people that he uses. Remember how the story went. Satan came, he filled the heart of Judas got Judas to accept that bribe and pervert justice and get Jesus arrested. And then when Satan was done with Judas and Judas realized what he had done and started looking for a rope to hang himself, Satan wasn't there for him. Satan didn't stop him. He just allowed him to be destroyed. Satan got what he wanted out of Judas, and then once Judas had done the damage that Satan wanted, Satan just went right back to destroying Judas. He's not loyal to those he uses. And so sometimes you get in a situation and you feel like your opponent could not be more wicked. They're just always lying. No constraint at all. It feels like it's almost demonic. They're being used by the enemy, and that may be the case. But just remember that when the enemy has used them for his purposes, he will turn on them. Satan's not loyal. So we're called to a fairness in our dealings. Called to fairness and radical honesty in the midst of conflict. And we're also called, if we're going to do justice, to strive for fairness to those who don't have the same access to fairness around us. Proverbs 31:9 says, "Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy." Proverbs 29:7 says, "A righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge." So a righteous person, someone who is just, is someone who knows the rights of the poor and defends them. And it's easy. In most societies, the poor and the needy can get trampled over by everybody else because they can't afford to go to court. They don't have access to the same justice. And so it can create a society where the rich and the powerful can get away with things and the poor can get oppressed and they can feel like they have no recourse. But just people don't just try to be fair themselves. They try to get fairness for those around them. And now, if we don't have a fear of the Lord, what's the incentive to give to those who can't give back? But Proverbs says that if you give to the poor, you lend to the Lord. If you fear the Lord, then there is incentive to help those who can't help themselves, even if they can't give anything back. The weakest and the most helpless get special concern from the just. Just people defend those who can't defend themselves. And this is why just people care for the rights of the poor, of the sick, of the elderly. And it's why they contend for the rights of the absolute weakest among us who could never defend themselves in the unborn. Doing justice means providing a voice to the voiceless so that everybody in society has the same opportunities. And what we're not trying to do as we get justice is get the same outcomes in life for everybody. That's actually a secular concept of justice and equity that isn't biblical. In Proverbs, you do see different outcomes. Some people working hard and getting more, working less and getting less. And Proverbs doesn't call that an injustice when that happens. But everybody should have the same shot at it. It's good to work to provide the same opportunities. So we want to advocate to give the unborn a shot at life, to give that weak victim a shot at justice over the people who trampled them. And we take up good causes when people can't do it alone. So we want fairness in our dealings, fairness in our conflicts. We want fairness for others around us in our culture. Much of justice is fairness. But justice in Proverbs actually goes a little bit further. There's a section of Proverbs that's about God and his blessing on the house of the righteous or the house of the just. And listen to what this says in Proverbs 3:27-29. "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it's in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, 'Go and come again, tomorrow I will give it,' when you have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you." So this passage and a number of others call people to not withhold good from others. So someone comes over, they want to borrow something that they need, and you could give it to them, you could loan that to them. He says, don't make them wait till tomorrow. Don't try to get out of this obligation by saying, yeah, come back tomorrow, and then you're not there tomorrow. Don't withhold the good that you could do for them now. But man, what would it be like if you lived that way? Like if you took that principle and applied that to your life, that I do the good for others that they're asking for. I mean, that sounds like that would be costly. It could actually get to where it's unfair. Because at times that would mean more for you and less for me. If I'm always trying to give and always trying to help, I'm now at a disadvantage. And that's right. Bruce Waltke says it this way. He says, "The wicked advantage themselves by disadvantaging others, But the righteous, the just, disadvantage themselves to advantage others. And this kind of fits the picture that's painted by Proverbs, where you have wicked people who are stealing from the poor to advantage themselves. Wicked people take without giving. They consume without working. They get for themselves without contributing. They speak what's not true, but they do so to serve themselves the best. They're always posturing and manipulating. And if I have to steal someone's reputation, if I have to steal the truth, if I have to steal justice from another, I'll do that as long as it benefits me. That's the heart of the wicked, and you see it again and again through Proverbs. But then you see the righteous, the just, who are willing to be disadvantaged to advantage others. They give to the poor. They give to the one who's in need and they can't pay back. They give their energies to speak for and to care for the weak. They accept less for themselves so that others can have more. And they're so radically devoted to the truth that they'll tell it even if it costs them. So truly just people do good for others even if it means there's less for themselves. And God just commands that kind of living as the life that is doing the justice that he requires, where we consider others before ourselves. And this totally flies in the face of some of the pseudo-psychological pop wisdom that says that everybody should be willing to disadvantage everybody else for the sake of my own boundaries, for the sake of being me, for the sake of what matters most to me, that if I inconvenience everybody else so I can ascend, well, so be it, because the chief end of man is to glorify me without the interference of anybody else. I alone matter. And there's like a whole industry of internet memes devoted to preaching this. Don't worry about anybody else. You do you, you rise, you ascend, and anyone who tries to get in your way is just a hater. But if everybody in a community thought that way, no community could ever hold together. I had a conversation this week with my dentist. Wasn't much of a conversation, it was mostly her talking and me saying, But she was talking about how short-staffed they are and how she hires these people to come to work, and they sign a contract, they say that they'll work, and then right after being hired, they say that they need a month off. And it inconveniences everybody in the office, it inconveniences all the patients, they have to call everybody who's got an appointment on the calendar and change all of that. And she says it's because they're just trying to advantage themselves. She thinks they're all just going to the lake instead. But we are fed this doctrine that says we're supposed to bring any convenience necessary to others so that we can be fulfilled. And we're told that that's healthy. But it is not healthy to live in a way that would destroy any community if everybody lived in that way, because nobody says it's healthy to not be connected to community. The just disadvantage themselves so that they can provide an advantage to others. They care for their neighbors, not just for themselves. This is a pretty high bar for how we're supposed to live. And the hard thing about the commands of God is that how we respond to the commands of God is how we respond to God. There's no difference between those two things. There's no such thing as someone who's defrauding his neighbor actively who's also walking closely with God. There's no such thing as someone who's not accepting some degree of difficulty in his or her life for the good of others, who is also living a just life and doing well in their walk with God. How we respond to God's commands is how we respond to him. And so we all recognize, man, I have fallen short. So how do I change? Well, here's what makes it harder is that changing into a person who does justice has to begin with the heart. Because Proverbs 28:5 says, evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely. Proverbs 12:5 says, the thoughts of the righteous are just, the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. So wicked people will do wickedness and just people will do justice. But if I look at myself and I've been doing wickedness, it's not like just starting to do justice is even within my power, because I'm not a just person. I have to be changed from the heart. So how do I do that? How do we change from the heart? Well, they're only changed. Our hearts are only changed by looking to our Savior, who's the only just one. They're only changed as we look to the cross and we look to that gospel story again and again. And if we see ourselves as the helpless ones that needed him to come and disadvantage himself to provide righteousness for us, then it's hard for us to look at other people's needs and treat them like they don't matter. In the gospel, we have this message that says that we were spiritually poor. We were the enemies of God. We had nothing to offer him. We had no access to his favor. We certainly didn't deserve his favor. We deserved his wrath. And honestly, that fact that God is a just God doesn't provide that much comfort when we look at ourselves honestly. The fact that nobody gets away with anything isn't exactly good news for those of us who've done wickedly. So Jesus saw us in our need, and he came to us. He satisfied the justice of God at great cost to himself. He died the death that we deserve, and he gave us, if we've believed in him, complete, undeserved forgiveness and salvation. He paid the price that justice demanded so that he could give us mercy. That's the gospel we believe. If we're Christians, we believe those truths. And when we believe that we were wicked and in need of forgiveness, we were needy and couldn't do it on our own, we brought only need and still he blessed us, then that has to change the way that we look at others. It'll change the way that we look at our enemies in conflicts because we were the enemies of God and he came and showed us mercy. It'll change how we look at people in need because we were in need and he didn't trample over us, he gave his life for us. It'll change how we look at the opportunities that we might have to deceive and to gain by someone else's losing, because in the gospel, Jesus lost so that we could gain. And if we worship that kind of God who was that generous to us, who gave his life, and we're becoming like that God that we worship, if we're gazing at the gospel, then we almost won't be able to help from becoming people who pursue fairness and beyond, who pursue the good of others as Jesus pursued our good. And if we believe that gospel, that part of us that wants to be out only for ourselves should increasingly shrink. So the gospel that saved us is the gospel that changes us and makes us into a more just people. And one of the ways that we preach the gospel to ourselves as a church family again and again is in taking this Lord's Supper. And when we take the Lord's Supper, we're saying Jesus didn't only do what was fair. Fair would have been just sort of letting us reap what we sowed and face the wrath of God. That would have been perfect justice. It would have been fine if he walked away and let us all receive the punishment that we deserve. But he went beyond what was fair. Knowing that we couldn't help ourselves, that we were poor and needy, Jesus did a positive good for us by giving his life. And so when we take this bread, we're saying that Jesus gave his life so that we could have life. When we take the cup, we're saying that this is the cup that represents his blood that was spilled so that we could be forgiven and so that we could have our greatest need met, which was to have a relationship with God. When we're taking this Lord's Supper, we're saying that Jesus didn't withhold any good from us that only he could give. And when we take this, we're saying, I believe that. We're saying, I believe this to be true. This is why the Lord's Supper, when we take this, if you're not yet a believer in these things, we'd encourage you to stay in your seats as we take this, because this is for people who, in holding that bread, are saying, I believe this. I believe the body of Christ was shed for me, and that's how I'm able to be in right relationship with God. I believe his blood was spilled for me, and that's how I know God. And so in taking the supper, we are proclaiming, I am a Christian. I do believe these things.